Well, cool. Well, welcome. Those of you who are coming in, go ahead and find your seats. Really great turnout, everyone. Good evening. I'm Jed Atkins. I'm the Dean of the School of Civic Life and Leadership at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And at the School of Civic Life and Leadership, we really want to equip leaders and citizens for constitutional self-government, to equip our students with the knowledge and abilities to make good decisions and to deliberate across difference and live lives of purpose in our pluralistic democracy. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event, which is on the Iran war and the reshaping of the global order. Tonight's event is sponsored by Skills Program for Public Discourse, which seeks to model constructive discourse on issues of national importance. And I can't think of a topic that's more in line with this mission than tonight's topic. And I'm honored that we are able to bring in such a distinguished group of experts to talk about an event as it unfolds. And many thanks to PPD's program director, the wonderful Nora Hannigan, for making this happen on such short time. Let's give it up for Nora. And I also want to thank the Krasno Events Series here at UNC for co-sponsoring with us. Well, we have an excellent panel in front of me, and I'll go ahead and introduce them. We have in the middle Klaus Larres, who is an expert on contemporary US and German as well as EU foreign economic and security policies towards the transatlantic world and China and Southeast Asia. He writes and lectures on post-Cold War geopolitics, US foreign policy, European integration, and the complex interactions that shape the triangle of US, EU, Germany, and China. He also served as a senior policy advisor at the German embassy in Beijing, has had fellowships at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and held the Henry Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Second, and I believe on my left, is Brian Katulis. Brian is senior fellow at the Middle Eastern Institute, specializing in U.S. foreign policy and national security. He hosts the MEI podcast series, Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, and authors the column, Making Sense, a regular take on U.S. foreign policy. Prior to MEI, he was a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he built the center's Middle East program. His career also includes significant experience at the National Security Council, the U.S. Department of State, and the U.S. Department of Defense. And last but not least, we have Joel Rayburn, who is a senior fellow in the Hudson Institute Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East. From July 2018 to January 2021, he was the United States Special Envoy for Syria. Until November 2020, he was also Special Deputy Assistant Secretary for Levant Affairs, responsible for implementing U.S. policy concerning Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. Before joining the State Department, he served for 26 years as a U.S. Army officer. Thank you for your service. With his final assignment as Senior Director for Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon on the National Security Council staff in 2017-2018. Finally, moderating this event, we have our own Mike Morgan, who specializes in modern international and global history. He's the author of The Final Act, the Helsinki Accord and the Transformation of the Cold War, which was recognized with the 2018 Edgar S. Furness Book Award for the best first book in international security. At Chapel Hill, Morgan teaches courses on international history, the Cold War, human rights, and grand strategy. I also want to remind the audience that the reviews expressed by panelists did not necessarily reflect those of the university or sponsoring programs, so please all feel very free to speak freely and speak your mind and draw on your expertise. And finally, I do want to thank our panelists for their expertise and for being available on such short notice to be able to bring this programming to us here at Carolina. And so now, with that introduction and no further ado, I'm pleased to turn the conversation over to Professor Mike Morgan. Let's welcome everybody.
Thank you all so much for being here. Can you hear me all right? I have this rather unusual microphone, very cozy this evening. Before we get started, I just want to give you a brief preview of the next 90 minutes. We're going to have a discussion among the panelists for the first hour, and then around 6:30, we will transition and open the floor up to questions. We'll then have about 30 minutes of Q&A and aim to wrap up by 7 o'clock. So 60 minutes of discussion, 30 minutes of Q&A. To start things off, I thought it would be helpful to examine very briefly the longer-term historical context and background of the current conflict. Tensions between the United States and Iran have been high ever since the 1979 revolution. So my first question is, how did we get from 1979 to today? Could you give us a brief historical snapshot of what happened in the long lead up to the current war?
All right, Joel has nominated me to try to do this really quickly, and blessed me as well. First, I wanted to thank everyone for showing up tonight. I was up late last night. I don't know if anyone watched that UConn-Duke game. I don't know if that's a sore subject down here, or is it a good subject? I went to Villanova undergrad, so think about that 10 years ago. I want to thank Klaus and Professor Morgan and my friend Joel Rayburn. We'll probably disagree a lot, and I hope we do. But to answer your question succinctly, and I'll try to do that, think of the relations since 1979 between the US and Iran like a four-act play. A four-act play where the fifth one is being written right now, and we don't know how that fifth one will play out. Act one was essentially 79 and through much of the 1980s. When you think about America in the Middle East today, including our military architecture and everything that's there, CENTCOM, it was created in large part in reaction to the Islamic Revolution in Iran, as well as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. If you remember the Carter Doctrine, President Jimmy Carter, he was the guy who gave the name to that doctrine, which essentially said it's in our interest to keep the free flow of supply oil out of there. Act one. Act two, I think, came after the first Persian Gulf War. That's the thing that got me into the Middle East. I speak Arabic, lived in Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Egypt. I travel to the region every month with the Middle East Institute, more or less. But I think Act two came in the US-Iran relations, and it came under the rubric of after we got Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, we had a policy of dual containment, of sanctions, of pressure both on Iran and Iraq in trying to isolate it. Act three, I think, came after the 9/11 attacks, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. In my view, and Joel will probably disagree with this, but I think that phase led to a historic expansion of Iranian influence westward. It had already begun in Acts 1 and 2, but it, I think, continued throughout. And that was mostly the first decade of this century. And then Act 4, and we'll come to Act 5, that's what this discussion is all about. Act 4 was more or less started at the end of the George W. Bush administration, when a number of people in the Republican administration and then Obama came in and picked up on a framework for negotiating with Iran. People forget that the P5+1 negotiation framework was set up under the tail end of the George W. Bush administration, and there was an attempt. And in Act 4, there was many different shifts and turns, and Joel was part of that history in the first Trump administration, where that Act 4 turned towards a strategy of maximum pressure, which I would argue President Obama used maximum pressure to get a form of it, to get to the negotiated settlement at 2015. We can disagree about whether that was a strong agreement or not. That's the four-act play. What happened on February 28th, and I think it's still too early to tell because we're only 4 or 5 weeks into a thing that I think will go on for a long period of time. I think this is going to be transformative, not just for the region itself or for the people of Iran, but it's going to be transformative in ways that we can't know in geopolitics and geoeconomics.
Yeah, great to see so many of you here, and thank you for this detailed explanation. I think three dates are particularly important when we think about the United States and Iran. The first, 1953, when both the Americans and the British got rid of a fairly freely elected Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh. That embittered the Iranian people ever after, and the Shah was returned, who was seen as a puppet of the United States. And then that leads us to the 1979 revolution, as a reaction, a long-term delayed reaction to what the British and the United States were doing in the 1950s and throughout the 60s and 70s. And after that revolution, of course, it caused a lot of bitterness on the part of the United States, not least because of the well-known hostage crisis, which we are all aware of, and the attempt of the Carter administration, which failed disastrously to free the hostages. So that led to a lot of bitterness on the part of the United States. And then, in a way, this culminated, and I'm skipping, of course, many episodes, but that culminated in what both sides tried to achieve in 2015 with the nuclear agreement between the United States and Iran and many other countries, including European countries and China and Russia, to really resolve the question whether or not the Iranians should have a nuclear weapon and how it could be prevented that they would ever obtain a nuclear weapon. And in my view, and this is of course quite controversial, the 2015 agreement was the way to go. That was a sensible agreement. It wasn't perfect by any means. The Iranians in the far distant future probably would still have had a chance to evade it and to develop a nuclear weapon, but it was an agreement which was meant to last for 12 years. And 12 years, of course, sounds in a way like a short period of time, but 12 years in diplomacy is actually a significant period of time. So for 12 years, the Iranian nuclear problem had been resolved. And what would have happened in these 12 years, no one knows. Maybe it would have been extended, maybe it would have been circumvented, but we know that while the agreement lasted, the Iranians actually stuck to it. They did not enrich uranium, they did not try to obtain a nuclear weapon. So there was at least a lot of potential in that agreement. The first Trump administration in 2018 decided that the agreement was no good, despite what all the experts were saying, including Trump's own experts, and withdrew from that agreement. And the next thing is, and I'm skipping a few things, of course, but the next thing is they start bombing Iran. And there were negotiations before the bombing, and these negotiations were actually trying to get back to the agreement in 2015, which Trump himself withdrew from. And when that didn't work and the Iranians proved difficult, and of course other countries were not involved, the Europeans were not anymore involved in these negotiations, neither were other great powers, then the bombing campaign was a culmination of that. The bombing campaign, in my view, is disastrous. It has already upended the whole energy question in the world, the whole global order. The one who is benefiting right now is not the United States, it's not Iran, it is clearly Russia, who is benefiting economically by being able to sell more oil at increased prices, and will be able to fight the Ukraine war much more effectively than they were only able to do in January. So in a way, of course, we don't know what will happen, how it's all going to play out. But right now, from my point of view, it looks very, very bad. Thank you.
To go back to your question about the history and how we got here, before 1979, Iran under the Shah was the United States' most important military ally, strategic ally in the region. It was a bulwark against the threat of Soviet expansion south toward the Persian Gulf. When the Shah was overthrown in the revolution, Iran flipped, became an ally after a while of Russia, but also became the most hostile power in the Middle East to the United States and to Israel. And in fact, permanent hostility to the United States and to Israel was really the organizing principle of the Iranian regime as it has existed since 1979. The formative experience of the current regime in Tehran was not the revolution, though. It was the Iran-Iraq War. The 8-year war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq led to the creation and expansion of the Revolutionary Guards Corps. They were on the front lines against the Iraqi army for 8 years. The Iranians lost several 100,000 killed and wounded young men and sometimes child soldiers. And in sort of a rerun on the Iran-Iraq border of World War I, of trench warfare, it looked like 1914 to 1918. That experience was so costly to the Revolutionary Guards and to Iranian regime leaders that when it was over, finally, 1988, 1989, which was exactly when the first Ayatollah supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, died and was replaced with the recently deceased Ali Khamenei as supreme leader. Under Khamenei and the rest of the leaders who inherited after Khomeini, they said, we're never doing that again. We're never doing that kind of war again. We will not get into a costly conflict that costs Persian blood. And instead, from that point onward, they launched a strategic doctrine by which they would not invest in a conventional army or air force or navy to defend themselves. Instead, they would work through militant proxies, largely in Arab countries, that they would use to mount a forward defense. A forward defense for them is they would have the means to destabilize the region around them and beyond in order to keep their potential enemies, including the United States, off balance and far away from the idea of threatening Iranian territory the way Saddam did. So it was never again will we go into that kind of conflict. Now, what we are seeing though, and for 30-something years, it worked. They essentially, the Air Force that was just destroyed was basically the Shah's Air Force. The Navy was about the Shah's Navy. Their army is equipped, I can tell you, with the Shah's tanks and maybe some Soviet tanks from the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. All of their army basically is sitting there as frozen in amber from 1974 or so. So they don't have any of those normal conventional military means to defend themselves. They use Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the Iraqi Shia militias, the Assad regime, etc., some Taliban, in order to have a ring around them of destabilization. And they used also those militant groups to exert political influence to try to control political affairs in some of those countries in order to align those countries as allies in hostility to the United States, Israel, and our other Arab partners and allies. And that doctrine works until someone calls your bluff and actually attacks your homeland and just says, you know, we're going to brave the idea that there's going to be a reaction from proxies outside Iran, and we're going to go straight to cut off the head of the snake, as the late King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia used to put it. So what we're seeing now, I think, is after 37 years, it's the culmination of a flawed strategic doctrine that in the end is crumbling in the face of actual military power from Israel and the United States and from others like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and so on. I think that's in military strategic terms, that's how we got here.
Wonderful. That's a terrific and concise historical overview, I think, of the American perspective and the Iranian perspective since 1979. I want to pivot now to...
It was really profound, I guess.
Really profound. We'll go home now. The lights are being shut off. We'll go home. I want to now pivot to talk about what's going on right now. The United States and Israel began bombing Iran on the 28th of February. There's a number of questions that come out of this. First question is, why? Second question is, do the Americans and the Israelis, in your view, have the same goals? And then the third question is, let's say from the American point of view, what is the White House's theory of victory? How will bombing produce whatever the strategic objectives of the Trump administration happen to be?
So if I take Brian's framework of a 5-act play and we're in the 4th act and we don't know how the 5th act is,
Yeah,
is going to, or maybe we're in the opening of the 5th act.
Yeah, we're opening the 5th
Okay.
act, sorry.
Well, I would say that within those acts, there are different scenes. And I think we're in a series, we're in a string of scenes that I think really intensified with the October 7th Hamas incursion into Israel. And then the next day was something just as important, but people forget. October 8th, essentially, Lebanese Hezbollah, led by Hassan Nasrallah, and the Iranian regime, led by Ali Khamenei, basically joined the war. They basically declared war on Israel and joined the war alongside Hamas. And then over time, they got the Houthis involved. So it was the entire, I described to you that sort of what the Iranians call a ring of fire around Israel of all those proxy groups and Iran. So there was an axis of resistance or a ring of fire war launched against Israel on October 7th and 8th, 2023. In my view, what is happening now is the inevitable, has been an inevitable series of counterattacks by Israel and the United States in response to that ring of fire war that was launched in October 2023. And there had been sort of a slow creeping conflict for a couple of decades before that, including in Iraq, and I was there for some of that, 2005, 6, 7, 8. But it really just, but in all of those earlier confrontations, the Iranians always acted by proxy, and the US and Israel and others only ever responded by attacking or confronting the proxy. It was never going back to pressure against Tehran. That changed when the Iranians joined that war on October 8th, and then in 2024 launched missiles from Iran proper, from Iranian territory, hundreds, against Israel for the first time, and Israel responded by overt air attack against Iran to degrade Iran's air defenses and its missile production in 2024. So it's not that you said the U.S. and Israel started bombing Iran on February 28th. They didn't. It was earlier. It was part of this. I think continuous arc of conflict that really goes to October 2023, and where we'll go. So let me stop there and let other panelists weigh in.
Yeah, thank you. If we put ourselves into the shoes of Israel, then it's quite understandable that Israel clearly feels threatened, has been feeling threatened by the Iranian regime for a significant number of years. You know, they have talked about the elimination of Israel, not that Israel doesn't have the right to exist. So the development of nuclear weapons in Tehran would, of course, be very frightening to the Israelis. Same also with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, clearly is a threat to Israel. So that Israel, particularly under a prime minister like Netanyahu, who has proven to be extremely ruthless regarding the Gaza war, that someone like Netanyahu would like to use the opportunity, if he can, to eliminate the Iranian regime, and thus, as he sees it, the threat to the existence of Israel is clear. I don't think it doesn't make it right, but I can see where the Israelis are coming from. And I think Netanyahu did drag Trump into the war against Iran. From an American point of view, the benefits to bombard Iran are much more unclear. And I was a little amused when you talked about a theory in the White House. I don't think there's any theoretical thinking anywhere in the White House. You know, there is perhaps ideas, but there is no developed strategy or no developed objectives. There is, of course, some thinking about what to achieve or not to achieve, but it changes by the day. There's certainly no theory. And initially we were told it was all about regime change. Then we were told it was about the nuclear danger. Then we were told it was about the ballistic missiles. or about the Houthis and similar Hezbollah, similar allies of the Iranians. And now it varies. Sometimes we are told all things will be eliminated. And recently, I think yesterday, Trump has already said that regime change is already achieved by taking out some of the leading heads of the Iranian government. And of course, there hasn't been a regime change. It still is the same bad clerical regime, though with different figureheads. So there is general confusion in the White House what they actually want to achieve. And from an American point of view, it, in my view, would have been much more sensible to continue trying to see whether negotiations would have led to anything, rather than in the middle of the negotiation starting a bombing campaign. This, I think, is also in diplomatic parlance quite unusual and really not the done thing. You negotiate in good faith and you start bombing in the middle of it. You know, the bombing campaign could still have been done, if you like, if these negotiations really were not leading to anything. But we were still in the middle of these negotiations, and the Omani foreign minister, for example, was quite positive that a deal was very close. Which of course was not the opinion of Witkoff and Kushner and Trump in the end. So it is unclear what the United States will actually get out of that war with Iran. Right now, we only get higher prices. We have problems in the Straits of Hormuz. We have turmoil and particularly economic turmoil in the wider world. And all that, of course, undermines Trump's and American credibility. And as I said before, it is not the United States which is benefiting right now. It might be Israel, perhaps, but it certainly is Russia and to some extent also China. Talking very briefly about China, while credibility of the United States, the image of the United States, even among its allies in Europe and NATO allies, is plummeting, China suddenly is being seen as a responsible country, as and Xi Jinping as a responsible global leader. And that is, of course, you know, not what the United States should be pushing for, and it is not really correct. But the image of China has suddenly been improved, that of the United States has plummeted, and Russia is benefiting economically and regarding its war against Ukraine. So I think regarding the United States, the whole enterprise is an utter disaster. Thank you.
Yeah, to answer the question why, and then maybe address some of the things that were left unaddressed. I had dinner with the Omani foreign minister hours before the war started. He happened to be in Washington, D.C. I think historians will have a really interesting time when there's a historical record developed about these negotiations and whether it was a serious possibility or not. I have my view on that. I think a nuclear deal that was better than what was achieved in 2015 was actually possible, but I don't think that's what the Trump team or Israel was driving towards. And if there's a theory,
Omani guys say?
And if you talk to Grossi at the IAEA and other places, that there was a better possibility for a better deal on the nuclear front. But when asked about the other issues, the aggression against neighbors, the ballistic missiles, the drones, the things that are a threat today to the Gulf states, Israel, and the entire region. I mean, they almost tried to hit a US base in Turkey, that there was vague talk about a non-aggression pact. I suspect what happened, and I think history is going to be really hard with this administration, with the second Trump administration, because there's not a lot of documentary evidence and things like that, is that, and I said to this, to His Excellency Busaidi, is I think they're using you as props again, meaning that they're just using you to show that the Iranian regime is not serious about these other issues. They don't even want to talk about it. And again, I'm just a clinical analyst. I'm skeptical about this war for a reason I'll tell you in a second. But if there's a theory of the case that I think the Trump administration has, Joel kind of said it, and this is how I put it, is that instead of actually playing defense, instead of reacting to the plays that Iran and its proxies were running for decades against the United States, against Gulf states, let's not forget them, and against Israel, President Trump had a theory, I don't think well thought through theory, but that we're actually going to flip it. We're not going to, if you use a football analogy, sorry for the sports analogy, we're going to flip it and we're going to make our opponents go on defense here. And I think it was the attempt to try to reestablish strategic deterrence for Israel, for some of our partners in the region. I think it's really complicated for some of our Gulf allies in the region. Here's why I'm skeptical of where we are, but it's still like four or 5 weeks into what I think will be a much longer campaign, is that it's one thing to have clear military goals. It's another thing to have a clearly expressed political end state, right? And if you listen carefully to what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Kane, Raisin Kane, as President Trump likes to call him, he actually think is much more precise because it is his role to eliminate the capabilities that the Iranian regime has to threaten the region. I don't hear, like you said, Professor, a clearly articulated goal coming from the White House, from President Trump, on what they want as an end state. It's almost like that game of three-card Monte, when you think about it, the street hucksters that try to steal money from folks. And this is, in essence, and I hope this is not unfair, I feel like Americans have been gaslighted into this war, and quite likely we may be gaslighted out of the war in terms of how we define victory and success. One day it's regime change. On day one, it was regime change. And this was built on what President Trump said after the horrific massacres of the Iranian people in January, where he said help is on the way. But then he'll shift the goalposts on any given day based on who I think he's talked to and things like this. Another day it's the ballistic missiles were going to be an imminent threat to the United States directly. Another time, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor in week one said Israel, in essence, made us do this because they were going to move, right? But it's this constantly shifting rationale. And what worries me about that is that we live in a democracy right now, and we're at a very curious point in our democracy on many different levels. And there's just a theory of the case that I think President Trump has here when it comes to political support for war. And I think Joel has looked at this, and David Petraeus, a man we both admired, did his thesis on political support for the war. This is a vulnerability for the United States when there's not a lot of support for the war. We've gone into this war essentially with the level of public support that we've had coming out of very long wars. And that's two things. It's a product of, I think, how the president messages this thing. It's also a product of our media and political culture, but that's a dangerous strategic vulnerability that I think makes it hard for people to bear the costs, and that the costs are going to come pretty quickly, right? There's a $200 billion supplemental bill in about 2 weeks that Congress will consider. Hopefully we'll talk about the domestic architecture. But you understand what I'm saying here is that if you go into the war not really clearly explaining the case, the threat, and then more importantly, the outcome. And the outcome, the political outcome is always different. The political end state is different than what you can achieve militarily. This is the thing we should have learned from 25 years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I fear that we live in the United States of amnesia when it comes to foreign policy and national security. And I think that's part of the product of a president who likes to preserve his strategic ambiguity. He likes to preserve his flexibility in several instances. But understand what I'm saying. As an American, we don't even have the conversation going on in Washington right now about how to lower the sort of security lines at the airport that Joel went through today. That's why I drove down here.
I breezed right through it.
Yeah, you breezed right through it because of ice, right? To say, no, we don't even have the conversations about things closer to home that are functional, let alone sending. The idea of we now have 50,000 ground troops in the region and sending more there. And the lack of that clear definition of a political end state as opposed to a military goal, I think it's more precise on the military front. And that opens up a bigger can of worms, which I hope you'll ask about geopolitically.
So I was one of the staff officers in the White House who staffed the decision to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear agreement. Why? Well, I mean, not why did I do it, but why was it done? I watched President Trump and his cabinet wrestle with the problem of the Iranian regime, and I don't mean the Iranian regime's nuclear program. The problem, the fatal flaw of the Iran nuclear agreement of 2015 was that it was an agreement only about the nuclear program, and it essentially took off the table economic pressure by the United States and the Europeans against the Iranian regime in exchange only for the Iranian regime to follow very narrow, specific guidelines about nuclear enrichment and some other things pertaining to their program. And all the sanctions were lifted. in 2015, 2016. They received a sanctions relief windfall, and then they used it to vastly increase their military budget and their terrorist budget to Hezbollah, the Houthis, and so on. And they sort of went berserk in the Middle East. We watched it happen 2016, 17, 18. And I watched that, and President Trump and the cabinet considered that intolerable. And the president sort of turned to the leadership team in the US and in Europe and said, and said, I need to be able to use economic pressure against Tehran because of what they're doing to Saudi Arabia, in Syria, et cetera, et cetera. And the answer that came back, especially from the Europeans, was, no, sir, sanctions are behind glass. You can only break them if they violate specific restrictions on their nuclear program. That was unacceptable to him, because it left basically the President of the United States with no choice, no non-war choice between war and capitulation. Those were two unacceptable outcomes. So in 2018, we shifted. But the point of getting out of the nuclear agreement was to be able to raise the economic pressure temperature through sanctions enforcement on the regime to try to curtail its terrorism, its missile and drone development, and so on. It was not first and foremost about the nuclear agreement. And so we entered into 2 years of sanctions pressure. They turned back on in November 2018. By the time we got to November 2020, they had worked very well at essentially forcing the Iranians to bleed out their foreign currency reserves. For those of you who are macroeconomists, you'll understand what I'm talking about. A regime, an economy can't survive without foreign exchange if it's dependent on imports. And there's only really one economy in the world that isn't, is kind of North Korea, and they get gifted things by the Chinese. Everyone else has to have foreign currency reserves. By the time of the end of the Trump administration, Iran's foreign currency reserves had dwindled probably to single-digit billions of dollars or euros or Swiss francs, whatever they were holding. In other words, they were probably and they were bleeding out. They would have burned through that in a matter of weeks. I think they were probably just weeks away from financial collapse, which would have meant they would have had to cry uncle, or they would have collapsed. Financial collapse in Tehran means collapse of the regime. If you can't, it doesn't matter how many Basijis you want to employ, if you can't pay them, eventually you won't have them at your disposal. And that was the moment at which President Trump, the Biden administration arrived, and then froze sanctions enforcement, and the Iranian regime then began to build up its foreign currency reserves. So I think by the time it got to the Trump administration again, at the beginning of 2025, there really was no, there wasn't space, I think, to do 2 or 3 years of a maximum pressure sanctions campaign in order to try to bring them back to that breaking point economically. So I suspect that's one of the reasons why. And there was an ongoing war, as we already said, between Iran and Israel, among others. So just a little bit of history but I will say that, so I think that does constitute a theory of the case. President Trump, I don't think anyone gets to be a billionaire by being an idiot. And also, President Trump made his career during the Reagan administration, when Iran was a strategic problem every day for essentially a decade, from 1979 all the way through to the end of the Iran-Iraq War in 1989. So I think if you go back and look at he's pronounced publicly on these things, he's been thinking about Iran. He may not say it as elegantly as some of us would advise him to say it, but he has been thinking about this problem for quite a long time. So I don't think it's true that there's an absence of strategy and absence of a theory. Now, we may not know what it is. I mean, they may not articulate it to us, but that on top. So what I agree with Brian is there are very clearly articulated military objectives. And yes, General Kane and Admiral Cooper, the CENTCOM commander, have been very good at saying what those are. There is not a clearly articulated political end state. You're 100% correct, but I think that's probably as much by design as anything else. That's the president's style. It may not be classically Clausewitzian, but that is the nature of the commander-in-chief that we have.
Granted, I hope you're right that the thinking in the White House is more profound than I have noticed. but you may well be right. I'm not, I wouldn't know. But the question
Well,
is,
I'd put it up against, for example, the UK or Spain or someplace else, for example.
oh, okay, we can go into that, but the utterances of Trump don't inspire one with confidence. And the utterance of his Secretary of Defense are even more appalling, to be quite frank, to talk about American casualties in that kind of casual way is, I think, totally, non-acceptable. But never mind. Let's hope the thinking is more profound. But wasn't it the ultimate aim of any president, unless the country is in imminent danger, to prevent war rather than go to war? And as far as I know, and that is what reports keep saying, is that Trump was emboldened by the quick Venezuela success, by the attack on Soleimani in 2020, also the 12-day war against Iran, which was mostly conducted by the Israelis rather than the United States. All that made him believe it would be a quick enterprise and he would achieve these goals in a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, but not what we just heard, that it may go on for many months. So I wonder, even if there was good, profound thinking, shouldn't the thinking have gone into the direction of preventing war and preventing all the turmoil we see right now, including, of course, what is happening with the Straits of Hormuz? And I understand that the American military made it pretty clear to him. It wasn't a big secret that Iran could do that had that chokehold on the world's economy, but that he chose to dismiss it, that he didn't go with the military advice he received. And also Kane talked about a lack of ammunition, talked about all sorts of possible military difficulties, which were dismissed by the White House. And I think that is very worrying. A president like Trump should really prevent war, if at all possible. And the country was not in imminent danger. Whatever we were told, there were no missiles targeted at the United States, maybe at some of the naval bases of the United States.
That's the United States.
Well, but there was no evidence that the Iranians were about to attack American naval bases in the Gulf states. They have attacked them now after first being bombarded by the United States, clearly, but were they about to attack naval bases in the Gulf? I don't think so.
I think we should keep things moving here. I'd like to ask about the Iranian perspective on the current war. The term political end state came up. I think that's a great term to use in this connection. What would you say are the current goals of the Iranian government in the war? Is the goal simply to survive? Are there broader goals beyond survival?
No, absolutely. Number one is to stay into power. And if I could pimp my own podcast called Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, you can get it on Apple and things like this. We did a series of discussions in advance of this war, not knowing that this war would happen, talking to Iranians, including Ahmad Sharji, who's a man who was an Iranian-American man detained for 5 years in Evin prison. And he was talking about his circumstance, but then also what's going on there. So I think number one, I think the regime and the remnants of the regime want to stay in power. They will kill, as General Jim Mattis said recently, any power that will kill on a mechanized level its own people to stay in power is going to be a difficult regime to dislodge. I think number two, since this war began, they're trying to inflict maximum costs, not just to the United States and Gulf states, but to the global economy. That it's not just the Strait of Hormuz that's a choke point. You're reading all of the articles. And even if, magically, President Trump grabs that golden ring and somehow gets the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament or someone to agree to a ceasefire, we're all going to be paying. You're already paying at the pump. We're all going to be paying for months on end. And I don't want to be alarmist, but the markets have not really priced this in, as according to the economic experts I talk to. So there's reasons why I think Iran are attacking their neighbors, because it doesn't make sense to me. You'd think they'd try to create divisions between the Gulf and Israel, and their attacks are essentially trying to impose costs on those countries that are the most interconnected with the global economy, not just through energy, but through trade and investment and a number of things. And Whatever you think of the Saudis, and I know they're a controversial country for obvious reasons, the fact that they had a investment conference in Miami last week, and I saw some of their top officials in DC, I think is a testimony to what they think as their future holds, no matter what happens with this war, is that they want to be building better linkages outside of oil and arms sales with the rest of the world. Iran's regime is trying to get in the middle of that. And the last thing I'd say, and the reason why I talk about these podcasts that I did, is that if you listen to the voice of ordinary Iranians and people who've lived there, I had Holly Dagras, who is a colleague of ours in another think tank, who, as a teenager, she was taken by her mother from LA, if you can imagine, to Tehran, and actually came of age in high school in Tehran, and to hear her story and to hear what it's like living there in full detail. And it's not just a sad story of repression. It is that, but it's also a story of Iranian people, especially the next generation, that wants something different, which is why I think so many were inspired by the words of Donald Trump in January when they were being murdered on an industrial scale. They wanted any sort of hope. What I worry about is, given whatever you want to call it and dress it up, flexibility or ambiguity, if you don't have that clarity of what it is you want to help the Iranians produce, or to produce in that end state, it then has spillover effects in terms of how the region looks at the circumstances inside of Iran. When I talk to Gulf states, they did not want this war to happen by and large, and it's not just Oman or Qatar. They were on pathways of de-escalation. They fear more, two things. Number one, chaos and civil war that spills out and spills refugees out, but they also fear that the Iranian regime would stay in place, become even more hardline, and have the capacities to continue to threaten. So we're in this sort of unclear space, which is why I'm hedging my analysis on this. Sorry if it's not, the story's not written yet, and it really depends on this test of wills of those that remain in power in Iran and want to remain in power and will murder their own people and many more and take them down with them, versus our will. And I think our will and our partners' will is quite confused and divided these days.
So a second what Brian said about the Iranian people, if you look at certainly since 2017, and you go back all the way to 1999, really the first student uprising against the Iranian regime, disaffected at that time. And the current Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, who seems to be the de facto leader of the regime, was the chief of the Revolutionary Guards Police, which went in and shot the protesters in 1999. And he was best friends with Qasem Soleimani, who was already Iran's the chief of Iran's external terror operations. But going all the way back to 1999, there's been this growing tide of disaffection in the population. It boiled over in what was called the Green Revolution of 2009, which was when basically there was a stolen presidential election and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was fraudulently given the presidency instead of another candidate named Mir Hossein Mousavi that got a lot of popular support. There was a big uprising at that time. And then there have been these cycles of uprising, and the regime has gotten more and more brutal every time, but the people still keep coming out. Even before this war happened, I think the Iranian regime, you're sitting there in Tehran in the Iranian regime, you're presiding over a state that no longer really functions except in one way, which is to organize violence against its own population. The electricity doesn't work. They mismanage their water. The economy isn't working. I mean, nothing is working in Iran except for the weapons. Now, they're having to, what are they confronting right now? What's happening right now between the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other is one of the most, it may be the most one-sided military confrontation in modern military history. I think you'd have maybe Battle of Tannenberg, but even that didn't win the war. Maybe you probably have to go back. I think probably the qualitative difference between the U.S. and Israeli militaries and the Iranian military, I think, and I'm not joking about this, resembles the face-off between Lord Kitchener and the Sudanese rebels at Omdurman in 1896, where you basically had mounted tribesmen charging into Gatling guns in 1896, and there was a young Lieutenant Winston Churchill there. That's how that's how big a military mismatch is happening right now. No contest whatsoever. The U.S. and Israeli Air Forces are flying 24/7 over the Iranian regime's capital. You cannot, are they governing their state? Are they moving reinforcements around and so on? I mean, they barely held on in January when they killed all those people, 30,000, maybe 41,000 we hear. They had to move forces from one part of the country to others to just cover hotspots. They had to bring in Iraqi militants from next door to do. Are they going to be doing that? Are they going to, if there's another uprising when the dust settles here, if there's a no-fly zone, which I think there should be, are they going to be moving their forces by aircraft to go and put down cities that are slipping out of their control? Are they going to be bringing in convoys of Iraqi militants? I don't think so. So they're really the military mismatch. If you're the Iranian regime, you don't have complete freedom of action here. You have very little freedom of action, and the longer this military pounding that you're taking goes on, I think the freedom of action they have to survive gets less and less and less. That's the way I see it as a military analyst. Yes, this is in the absence of a clearly articulated political end state by the United States leadership and its allies. This is true, and maybe even discordant ones. And yes, we hear different end states. Maybe it's a Delcy Rodriguez will be okay with. Maybe Mohammed Bakr Kalibov can be a Delcy Rodriguez. It's postulated. I don't think so. Maybe the Israelis want to see straight out regime change. They want to see a collapse of the regime replaced by something else that's more benign. Others may want something more in between. So yes, there's a discordance about the political end state, but it will be colored by what is an absolute shellacking in the military sense. There will be no Iranian military power left other than maybe, these Basijis and so on internally, and the Israelis are starting to kill them. The Israelis today gave a report saying they thought they'd killed 2,000 of those forces on the ground just since Friday in the space of 2 or 3 days. So if that's the phase that they're moving into, then it's going to be very, very difficult for this Iranian regime to survive that pressure cooker when it already had really run out of gas on its own economy, on the social contract, and so on.
I think we have time for one more question as part of the panel discussion, and maybe Professor Larres, you could start with this. I'd like to ask about the global consequences and reverberations of the war. How is this war, how will this war affect, for example, the future of NATO, the situation with Russia and Ukraine, China and Taiwan, the global system more generally?
Thank you. That's a good question. I would like to continue with what you said, and I think you're quite right that, of course, the military dominance of the US and Israel is impressive, if you like, but will it not also lead other countries to conclude if they have a nuclear weapon, that wouldn't happen to them? So the proliferation of nuclear weapons as a lesson from that the Iranians really find it difficult to defend themselves, will probably sink down in Saudi Arabia, in South Korea, maybe in other countries, and some of them we don't really want them to have a nuclear weapon. So I wonder if the Iran war as a global repercussion will lead to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, that many more countries will try to achieve a nuclear weapon, above all Saudi Arabia. Regarding NATO, I think NATO, as we know, is not on the best terms with the Trump administration, or to put it that way, Trump is not on the best terms with NATO. That is probably more fair. He always suspects NATO of ganging up on him, doesn't really respect NATO at all. And we see a division in NATO as a consequence of the turmoil we have now, that the Secretary General Rutte is very condescending, is very, not condescending, yeah, exactly, to Trump, is sucking up to Trump, is really saying everything is right, Trump says, and that has met a lot of opposition within NATO. So NATO is becoming divided about how to react towards the Iran war and towards what the Trump administration is doing. And Trump, of course, keeps repeating that Article 5 might not be meant seriously, things like that, which of course I hope that that isn't the case, but NATO is in crisis because of the Iran war. and the Europeans are in crisis because Trump is putting pressure on the UK in particular, America's most trusted ally apparently, but now they are in the doghouse because they apparently are not helping enough and have refused to help to provide support for the US in the Iran war, and other NATO countries, will not support it either. Maybe once the war is over, but certainly not during the course of hostilities. I can't see the Germans sending troops or ship to the Straits of Hormuz while the war is continuing. Perhaps afterwards, but even that I wonder. Then the global turmoil regarding the energy markets, we have already talked about, the plummeting stock market. So I feel we are basically having to rely on lots of global economic and geopolitical turmoil long after the war is finished in one way or the other. It's not looking good, as I've said before, and it really depends also how the Trump administration and the European allies are actually cooperating. And that, I think, would be the secret of bringing back some sort of stability to international global politics, is if Trump and NATO and the Gulf states are actually cooperating, hopefully soon. Thank you.
No need to panic. I used to be a staff officer at U.S. Central Command, which is the theater command, which is prosecuting the war. The war is going, militarily speaking, the war is going better than we could have, in our wildest dreams, been able to prosecute the campaign. We're just in the middle of it. The law of gravity. So right now, the propaganda war, the Iranians are able to sort of puff themselves up and so on. And the Strait of Hormuz hasn't been tested yet. That will happen. And then the law of gravity is going to operate on the Iranian regime, on global opinion, and so on. The energy markets are up significantly. They're nowhere near what they were when I was in Iraq during the surge, during the Bush administration. At the height of the surge in the summer of 2008, the oil prices spiked to over $150 a barrel. If you're President Trump and Secretary Rubio and Bessent and so on, you're looking at $105 oil, 110, and you're thinking, okay, it's high, but it's not uncomfortably so right now. They would hope, I think, to wind it up by the summer, so there's not that kind of spike. I think they believe they have some room for maneuver there. But I think more generally, I think the attitude of President Trump and a lot of people in the U.S. government and in the U.S. Congress was that the Iranian regime has been a rogue state which has been building illicit weapons and sponsoring terrorism for decades, got to the point where they were building an arsenal of ballistic missiles, which obviously was threatening not just to the region around them, but beyond. They intervened in the Ukraine war. It was Iranian drones and missiles which devastated Ukrainian cities and are still doing that. And no one did anything. I think President Trump and the leadership team and some leading members of Congress say this ends now. We're not going to let this continue as though this is 1936. We're not going to let it get to 1939 with the Iranian regime, because that is where the Iranian regime is headed. They appear not to be deterrable by means short of that. I think that is the conclusion that the policy and national security strategy conclusion that they and some key and probably a lot of people in Congress came to.
Yeah, if I could just say two things. You noticed something went on with my chair there. How I felt about my previous chair is how I feel about the international liberal order. It was making some strange noises, and I thought it was going to break. We could blame the Pat steaks I had, cheesesteak I had in Philly yesterday before the ball game. Two things on this moment, on the bigger picture, because I agree with a lot of what Joel says on the military front, and I think you're right. It's not even a close fight in terms of conventional military, but when you widen it out to the global scene right now, I think the picture is less clear, and that's what worries me. Some people use this phrase, CRINCS, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and we all try to come up with sort of phrases that conceptualize what's going on in the world order right now. And I see these countries, their regimes, not their people to be clear, but their regimes operating like termites on the international order, the trading systems, our own political systems, invading sort of our own minds and our algorithms in social media as well. It's one where open societies are vulnerable to them. And I think there's a theory of the case by going after one of these very strong adversaries in the region, but then also one that has global reach, that you'll actually have a ripple effect that will weaken them. I think that's Joel's theory of the case. I don't see it just yet, just because of, as what Klaus said earlier, how Russia has, at least in the short run, benefited from this. More importantly, how Russia, I think, has gamed this discussion that President Trump and Marco Rubio, this prolonged discussion they've had on the Ukraine war, which I think is a real threat to the international system. And the fact that I think the Biden administration should have woken up earlier when Iran was helping the regime in Russia, in Moscow, with its drone warfare. Now you see it going both ways. Now you see the Russian regime benefiting and aiding the Iranian regime on intel and some of these things that I think U.S. sites getting hit. So the risk in two points here is that, you know, a lot of strategists say don't go to war with two different opponents at the same time. What I worry about is when I look at President Trump's second national security strategy, his defense strategy. As a think tank guy, I read these things. These are documents that came out on the eve of this war with Iran. Do you know what these documents said about the Middle East? They essentially said we're going to deprioritize the Middle East. We're going to have a MAGA focus on Western Hemisphere and focus at home. So fine, you know, documents say one thing, actions can say another. But I worry about, we're at the point of so much strategic flexibility and ambiguity that it comes to some sort of incoherence. And I worry that our partners, we're at war in multiple fronts. The partners that we hit with tariffs repeatedly, and then we're shocked when they won't show up in the Strait of Hormuz to help reopen it, right? Those sorts of things, and even quietly, Gulf partners, which I can talk about in the Q&A, and Joel and I actually been to the region together, places like Saudi Arabia a few years ago, that very subtly and quietly, these countries are trying to diversify and hedge from the United States, even though it will remain their strategic partner of choice. So that's a war on one front, is like, who's our partner, who's on our team, whether it's in the fight against China or the fight against Iran. The second war, which I alluded to already, is the one here at home. And it's the one against ourselves. And if there's one thing that have become my personal mission, it's that I think a big strategic vulnerability we have in America is ourselves, our divisions, our ideological and partisan divisions that I think are stoked by a lot of these outside powers. That doesn't make me a mushy, soft, mealy in the middle, split the difference sort of guy, but I'm the sort of guy who wants to have honest debates that aren't rancorous and talks about these things. And why that matters at a war like Iran, I alluded to it before, is we're at a political moment that I think is quite urgent. No matter if the costs are only $105 a barrel, people are feeling it. And the support for this war is only at a third, last time I checked. And we actually still have a democracy where our elected representatives will be asked to vote. Not in the way that they weren't asked to vote about whether we should go to war or not, but will be asked to vote to commit more resources or not. 200 billion, if the estimate is correct. And that's going to be, I think, a very tricky moment quite soon.
Can I just add something very briefly? And we should talk maybe in the question period about international law, you know, which has really not come up at all. You know, for many people in the global south, they viewed our condemnation of Putin invading Ukraine with suspicion. And now they say, well, what's different? Putin goes into Ukraine, Trump goes into Iran. What is the difference? Of course, to us, it looks very different. We see the difference. But to many people in the global south who are not affected directly by either of these conflicts, that doesn't look different at all. So we condemn Putin, but then we do the same in Iran. How is that different? That is to them very hypocritical. That undermines the entire Western world, including, of course, the United States. And I think that needs to be addressed by means of international law.
The time has come for our Q&A period. Our panelists have raised a number of really rich points to follow up on. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And I believe, do we have someone passing a microphone. The mic will come to you.
You just talk into the box.
And please, why don't we take, should we say 3 questions at once? And then we'll take clusters of 3 questions. Please keep your questions brief.
Okay, well, I'm very concerned about Russian influence on us and others. But I'm also worried about, I'm concerned whether where the nation building could occur in Iran in the sense of al-Masri, the opponent of Ahmadinejad, is he still around? Is anything that goes back before the Shah still viable? Because I don't want to go back to Savak under the Shah, who was not a real Shah. He was a sergeant in the army, I think. And I'm just very, very concerned. I was wondering if you could address the hopes for nation building.
What could a future Iranian regime look like?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we're going to do 2 more.
Hello. So the panelists discussed, the United States' vast conventional military superiority and sort of the will to commit to war. And when I hear that, I feel like in another time I could be in a room listening to William Westmoreland talk about how we destroyed the North Vietnamese so effectively. But naturally, the political outcome of that war was a failure for the United States. So my question would be, what is the difference? And have we learned the lesson of committing to wars that we have not generated the sufficient political will to prosecute to their fullest?
Thank you. One more question.
Yeah, I guess, hello. Briefly on that note, I just wanted to ask, are we entering an era in which it's helpful to consider this war framed in similar bipolar terms as the Cold War paradigm, or are things far more complicated? Thank you.
3 quick questions. Who'd like to begin?
Let me take the last one first. Cold War paradigm. I think that's exactly what it is. I don't think the Cold War ended. There was in the 30 years of war, there was a 12-year truce in the middle of it, and there's just sort of a restart of hostilities, or it was preceded by a 12-year truce. I honestly think historians in the future will look back and see that there was a bit of a truce after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union. But yes, I honestly, as a national security strategist, someone from inside that system, that military system, that's what it has always felt like to me, is that we were facing a strategic alliance. It started out as a coalition, sort of an alignment that has grown into an operable alliance of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, the Assad regime, Lebanese, Hezbollah, Cuba, and a couple of others. And I think what the Trump administration is embarked on is picking off the minor members of that adversary revanchist coalition. And this is the game. This is the contest for the 21st century. I think that's what we're in. The war that we're in right now, I think, is the first major war of that. Well, alongside Ukraine. Ukraine's another one.
Regarding your question, I don't think we are having a multipolar world. At the moment, we still have a unipolar world. The US is still quite dominant, both militarily, but also economically and in other respects. We are moving towards a multipolar world. And of course, China, Russia, and other countries would love that to have that, to arrive that. But at the moment, we are not there yet. But the US is quickly squandering all its unipolar influence and power it has. And in my view, the Trump administration is doing its best to undermine the nation economically, culturally, scientifically, foreign policy-wise, militarily by, the blowing out of all that ammunition, which we may well need in some other military theater. So really the nation is undermining itself from my point of view. Regarding Westmoreland, I quite agree. There is no popular support for the Iran war now because it's like a video game, airplanes doing the bombing. It's very, very few casualties so far. So it's really like a video game. As soon as ground troops are being put in, and that is what the Trump administration seems to be about to do, we will have casualties, a lot of casualties. And then I think the war comes home. And then I think the opposition to the war and what is happening will also increase, because I can't see any support apart from some very strong supporters of President Trump, but the majority of the country don't seem to be in support of going to war against Iran. And regarding the future of the regime, well, basically we have two options. If the regime stays in power, we will have a more hardline regime, as you also pointed out, and that will not be pleasant, neither for the people of Iran nor for the outside world. If the regime falls, which probably is the best option from our point of view at least, then we will have a transitionary government. Lots of chaos like we saw in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein, and that may go on for many years and will also create a lot of violence and turmoil until hopefully some sort of more stable, hopefully more liberal government gets introduced into Iran or develops. But that, I think, unfortunately, is quite some way off.
Yeah, so I think those two scenarios are broad categories, but I'm a think tank guy, and we actually work through all of these different things. I think there's a scenario, there is a scenario, I don't think that's unrealistic, that you could have remnants of the regime that make some sort of deal and actually repress their people. And I think that President Trump would be happy with that, and they would maintain law and order so long as they commit to those sorts of things that the people they killed would not commit to, which is threatening your neighborhood and the region. There are any number of scenarios, and along the worst case scenario, I think, is what I've seen unfold in other parts of the Middle East over the last several decades. Some of it as a result of US action in part, but mostly factors within. And it's sort of the Mogadishu on the Mediterranean that is Gaza today, sort of temporarily paused, but Hamas is still in power. Or the chaos that Joel and others were dealing with inside of Syria. I hope that does not happen in a country of more than 90 million people. I hope the best case scenario is one that there is a framework for transition, and there's so many good people in the next generation in Iran. What's clear to me is under President Trump, we're not going to be deeply involved if that's a transition at all. We're not going to be underwriting it. It'll be somebody coming from within. Really quickly on paradigms and Cold War and things like this. I think it's, you're a student here? Are you a student? Yeah. I think it's up to you and to help us to rethink our old paradigms, right? And we grope for things like this is the new Cold War and things like this. I'm getting to be an older guy, right? And I grew up with my teenage son in terms of the different ways of how to describe how the world acts. I said, many people think it's like a board game of Risk, right? Territory and moving armies and things like this. I think increasingly the world is like Jenga, meaning if you pull something out, and again, this makes me more of a probably liberal internationalist, still have faith in some of these regimes that actually have a force multiplier effect. But we need to sort of go beyond sort of the black and white paradigms and think through, okay, because that's what I see in the Middle East constantly. It's a very complicated story. We didn't talk about it in terms of the Gulf states and how they view this war, and it's changing and evolving the longer the war goes on and things like this. But I urge you, I beseech you to help create sort of the new ways of how people should think about this. And clearly, your question, the answer is no. We have not, and what baffles me in terms of President Trump, I'm not a big fan, but he's a powerful political actor and he's innovative in his own way. He does not build coalitions at home, he fragments them. He similarly does this. This is his way of getting leverage. My worry about that modus vivendi at home and around the world is that I don't know that it'll have long-lasting effects, meaning the sorts of things that were built in the wake of World War II and our military victory in World War II, you had people actually thinking ahead of the curve and thinking what needed to be built in place. And, you know, I didn't go to the Board of Peace meeting in Washington on the eve of this war, but when I hear people who are countries that are part of that Board of Peace, if you know what I'm talking about, themselves skeptical, even when they put money into it, I think, oh my gosh, we're in a really difficult sort of global landscape and then a domestic political landscape where he's not even taken the care to mention the Iran war in his State of the Union address, which is quite a contrast to what George W. Bush did, or I would say Barack Obama did in the campaign against the Islamic State. It's a completely different method. Maybe it'll work out, but color me skeptical.
3 more questions, please.
As a European, I'm intrigued and enthralled listening to you, gentlemen. One of the things that I hear you say, and I hear other people say in this country, is that Iran was a rogue state. And yet America, if I understand correctly, is using Pakistan. I mean, do you see the irony of this? You know, with the Pressler Amendment that went through the Senate and the Congress of the United States, they weren't allowed to have it. And then the America and its politicians allowed Pakistan, which makes Iran some days look like a picnic. And yet that's where the negotiations are going on. And when I listen to the military person there, it horrifies me, because I'm thinking if I were in Tehran over the last 4 weeks, I'd be thinking in terms of your colleague who said about in Vietnam that we have to destroy the village to save it.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. This has been really interesting to listen to for the panel, but specifically for Joel. I was just curious if America has this all planned out, if America has such an exceptionally strong military and everything. How has it been the case that there have been so many war crimes? Like particularly at the beginning of the war, America bombed a girls' elementary school, killing hundreds of girls. There have been so many other similar things. And even particularly with the girls' school, it took weeks for America to admit any responsibility for that. And I don't believe that there's any going to be like war crimes prosecution for that. And I would just appreciate if you guys could speak to the state of human rights in the war.
So mine, in contrast to that, is back to military strategy. As somebody who doesn't study military strategy or economics directly, I'm curious as to how we should look at the Strait of Hormuz in terms of what we should be afraid of happening. As I understand, it is a volatile thing for us to, or Iran to, actually bring warfare into that area, especially since there's, I think, 20% of our world oil trade coming in and out, and how that affects both our relationship with China and the rest of the Middle East.
Thank you. Over to the panel.
Can,
We're going to sneak one more in. Okay, one more.
Right on. All right.
Got a quick one. I heard the words strategic vulnerability, and that's all over the news, excuse me, in terms of the oil all the time. I'd like you to speak to the question of the strategic vulnerability of drinking water.
Yep.
I think if they start taking out some of those desalinization plants and the population doesn't have enough to drink, that could be a real biggie. I'd be interested in your view of that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
quickly on the military aspect of, or let me just deal with it on a military level. It's, the Strait of Hormuz, the ship channel is only a mile wide. So, and it comes very close to Iranian territory. So in the past, it's been very easy for the Iranians to mine it, to have fast attack craft that can harass boats or attach mines to boats, anti-ship cruise missiles, which are fired, and they hit a target so fast, your anti-counter missile systems are very difficult to use, and then drones in that area. What the U.S. military has been doing is basically clearing the Persian Gulf littoral on the Iranian side of those kinds of bases and assets and warehouses that house those kind of things, and attacking the little islands that the Revolutionary Guards Navy uses to launch those kind of attacks. It's going to get to a point where the military is going to turn to President Trump and say, we think we have neutralized enough of those threats, pushed them far enough inland where it's possible to force the strait with a naval mission and so on. That could be a couple of weeks away. Yeah, but the further away they are, then you see them coming and you can knock them down. And drones move really slowly. If a drone has to come from the interior of Iran, it's not much of a threat. By the time if you have U.S. Navy destroyers there, which have exquisite counter drone and counter missile systems. So, but that's the point: is to try to move the threat to the interior so you can see it coming and knock it and block the shot, if you will. War crimes. Do you think that American targeters targeted a girls' school on purpose at U.S. Central Command in Tampa, Florida? I was part of that command. Doesn't happen. That's not who we are. It does not happen in the U.S. military. For it to be a war crime, there has to be an element of intent. Sometimes you can have collateral damage. You have horrible tragedies. I don't know what happened in that case. I haven't seen the results of an investigation. I know there's a very thorough investigation going on. I've been part of that system that does those kinds of investigations. But you have to have more faith in your country than that, than to think that, no, seriously, guys, come on. Doesn't happen. That kind of thing doesn't happen. It can happen sometimes on an individual basis, and then you punish those people. There's absolutely no way in hell that the U.S. military targeted a girls' school on purpose. I've been part of that command. There are 50 lawyers involved in evaluating targets. Does not happen. Doesn't mean you can't make mistakes. You do make mistakes. We mistakenly hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, for example, during the Yugoslav war when I was a young officer in NATO. But think better of your fellow Americans than that.
I would agree that it wasn't done intentionally. It would, of course, be horrifying if that was done intentionally. However, the way our Secretary of Defense, who calls himself Secretary of War, which hasn't been confirmed by Congress, by the way, it still is a Secretary of Defense, how he talks about casualties in war, his approach to war, this, of course, doesn't inspire confidence. And that, of course, brings up doubts in people's mind. Was it done intentionally or not? I agree with you, it's unlikely, highly unlikely that it was done intentionally, but the doubt shouldn't even come up. And someone like Heck says he shouldn't be in charge of a 9/11 corner shop. He should certainly not be heading the Department of Defense with that sort of attitude. Relieving him, putting someone more sensible, more reasonable into that department would actually do away with doubts which cropped into your mind, I believe. So a lot of improvements could be made, but I agree that it would be absolutely horrifying if it was done intentionally, which I would exclude. Regarding the Straits of Hormuz, I think now insecurity has been introduced. Even if Iran's missiles are being contained and the Houthis are still there, some other terrorist organizations will still be there. They may not have the ballistic capabilities like Iran has at the moment, but insurance companies, ship companies will not entirely rule out the possibility that some missile will suddenly arrive on a tanker. It will increase insurance premiums. It will increase the caution of people going through the Straits of Hormuz, which means in the end, you and I, the consumer, will pay for much higher oil and gas and LPG and fertilizer costs and so on. So I think in that way, the economic legacy of the war will mean much more cost for everyone else, and particularly the consumer. Though in the end, I would also assume that the ballistic missile danger will be contained to at least a large extent, but insecurity will remain.
Just a word on Pakistan, because I think it's a very good point. I think it points to the very pragmatic and transactional nature of President Trump. I think part of the reason, it's not just Pakistan, but I would add Turkey and Egypt to the list. And what I understand from officials in the Gulf, but counterparts in think tanks in the Gulf as well, is their position, except for Oman, we can put that to the side, is that we will not be involved in a negotiation or discussion while we're getting hit, right? And their position also happens to be, we're not going to urge the United States and Israel to stop this war, even though we weren't in favor of it, because if this regime is somehow magically left in place, if something is left in place, which I think is a suboptimal scenario for those Gulf states, we don't want to incentivize that sort of behavior of hitting us. The desal question, I think, is a very important one. And I think the fact that it was mentioned publicly, I think, by the Iranian regime and the fears and the targeting of Abu Dhabi, it came around the time when President Trump, I think, the timing on this, said we might hit the electricity grids of Iran. And I don't know if that's a war crime or not, if we state that and then go ahead and do that. Is it a crime again? Is that? I don't know. I've heard different
No,
views on
because
that.
it can be ruled, because if you have infrastructure that is dual use, that is supporting military forces, and war effort, then it is illegal. I'm sorry, sir, that's the law of armed conflict. That's the Geneva Convention.
Yeah.
That's part of that whole school of military law. It just is. I mean, the Irish military and the UK military adopt exactly the same legal standard.
But on Pakistan, there's an article just came out by Robert Kagan, who's a noted sort of former neoconservative, but he doesn't even talk about Pakistan. He worries. This is not my view, but he worries that America has become the rogue state in this. And it's an argument that I know, hopefully at dinner, Joel and we can debate it. I don't buy it entirely, because I don't think what we are right now is, there's a lot of clarity to what it is that we're out there, but it's an argument that Kagan makes, which is surprising and interesting.
Which Kagan?
Robert. Yeah, Bob Kagan. Yeah, well, there you go. Well, of course, because I think it should be up for debate, and friends should be debated. And by the way, you termed him the military guy. He's not just the military guy. Like he's a strategist that I think I might disagree with 90% of the time on certain things.
Oh, not 90.
Yeah. But the sort of, and then look, if the world were a different place, and if we had people in diplomatic positions, senior diplomatic positions, I think things could actually be looking different, even a year plus into this Trump administration. Last thing I'd say on war crimes, and I'm glad you brought it up, and I hope we continue to inject sort of that discourse, the things like responsibility to protect. All of these things, I think, died not under Donald Trump or Joe Biden, or even Barack Obama. It sort of collectively died over the last 10, 15, 20 years. It pains me as a guy who's center left on the spectrum in the United States that when the Syrian war led to massive atrocities, there was nobody protesting the mechanized murder of the Assad regime against its own people. And we've lost this sense of humanity. And that's why I think, I wish at least our leaders, whether or not, I hope people are held accountable, but at least we shouldn't lie about what happened. And we should at least have it in our own humanity, even while at war, to express remorse for those who are caught in the crosshairs. Because I've lived in Gaza. I've worked there. I've talked to people throughout this horrific war. And they know the deal as well. They know that Hamas was hiding in their own neighborhoods. And I know people who've lost people in their own family. And when we start thinking about this in a tit for tat, black and white sort of way, and forget the humanity of the people who are suffering, and can't speak to 175 young women and their families who were killed accidentally, and if it wasn't a war crime or not, what worries me the most is that we don't have the grace, gravitas, and dignity to actually say, we're sorry we did this. And I know that sounds foolish at a time of war to say this, but at a certain point, I think in the long game of Iran, of helping the Iranian people lift themselves up against their horrific oppressors, that sort of human dignity is essential.
If you paint a larger picture.
More short questions.
Three more?
Three more short
Okay.
ones.
Three more
Please ask the
questions.
question concisely and.
Hi, I had a question. This has been a very controversial question, but would the world be more peaceful if Iran did have nuclear weapons? And my evidence for that is North Korea. You don't read stories about North Korea and the US trading fire every 6 months because they have nuclear weapons. Would those 13 Americans be dead? Would that school, that girls' school be bombed if Iran just did have nuclear weapons and that we just didn't bomb them and we never traded fire? That's my question. Kept it short.
Let's see here.
Last question.
Do you think there's a chance that this conflict escalates into a world war?
Regarding North Korea and nuclear weapons in Iran, I would say North Korea is not necessarily a factor of stability in international politics. That would be a huge exaggeration. So I would assume it's the same as Iran. I think it wouldn't be advisable on the whole if neither North Korea, if you could turn the clock back, or Iran had nuclear weapons. It certainly would increase instability rather than increase stability. Regarding that evil regime, of course it is an evil regime. We know very well what's going on in prisons in Tehran. We know, we just recently have to look at the protests. Over 30,000 people were killed and executed, and we know they were deliberately targeted, often in the eyes and particularly body parts. You know, there's no doubt about the evil nature of the regime. There are many evil natures in the world. The United States is actually cooperating increasingly with Russia. You know what's going on in Russian prison cells? Or in China, or in Myanmar, or in many other parts of the world. Why Iran? Why? What gives us the right illegally to invade a sovereign country? Though we have, of course, problems with that regime, and they are threatening Israel, as you rightly said. So on that basis, we could really invade everyone, and the United States decides by itself who is evil enough to be invaded. That is the right of the mighty. That is which only a few countries can afford to do, like the United States, who would have the military power. This is, in the end, leads to the law of the jungle, as also Robert Kagan said in his recent book. And I think that is not the way to go. We should really stick to international law and the sovereignty of nation states, even if that nation state is pretty terrible. Also, and one last word on that, the Cold War was fought, of course, between the United States and the Soviet Union largely. And the Soviet Union, as Mike Morgan and I have studied extensively, was also an evil regime. And the United States did not fight the Soviet Union in order to end the Cold War. The Cold War ended by entirely different means, by talks, by negotiations, by engagement, by economic pressure, definitely, and lots of other means, but not by bombarding Moscow or St. Petersburg or other cities. And one reason, of course, is the Soviet Union had a nuclear bomb. It would have been rather foolish to do so. But, you know, there are other means of pushing a regime to the corner, of overcoming a regime, than by bombarding the peoples of that country, which leads to all sorts of collateral damage. So I think, you know, it is easy to say that's an evil regime, let's bomb it back into the Stone Age or get rid of that regime. That is, I think, in a way simplistic, and usually, as we now see with Iran, it's not as easy as the Trump administration seems to have believed right at the beginning.
Yeah, so if I could say three quick things and let Joel have the last word. One, on the, I don't agree with your idea, in part because I think if Iran got a nuclear weapon, pretty quickly you'd have that cascading effect throughout the region, and I heard it from top officials in the Gulf themselves. And the thing, I don't know what the Disney movie was where the song is, "We Don't Talk About Bruno." Remember that? What we don't talk about now is the crisis of proliferation on the nuclear front around the world. Like, we're so, and I don't know how you solve that right now, but we're in a period where China in particular is building up its arsenals, and it's having this cascading effect, and it's very worrisome. Second, thanks for lifting up your voice. I can't, you know, it must be extremely hard to think about family members and things like this. What worries me, going back to the political point I'm making in the United States, and it's a political analysis, it's not a partisan or ideological point, it's that it troubles me that on the left and on the right, and there are voices like Tucker Carlson on the right, and then what I call these days so-called progressives. Sorry if you find that offensive. I used to work at the Center for American Progress for a decade and a half, and my big problem with so-called progressives is that they're highly selective about the people that they care about and the humanity of people that they care about. I mentioned with the Syrians, I feel the same way on Iran as well. There's almost this knee-jerk, I would call it idiotic, oh, you want another Iraq war and another debacle, and it doesn't see you. It doesn't see the struggles that you and tens of thousands of Iranians have faced, are faced, and will face. Because no matter what happens in the next few months or year or two, I predict this will be a long, long, long road ahead for the Iranian people. On the prospect of the Third World War. Look, I wrote like a couple of weeks ago, you can read my stuff at mei.edu. I highly suspect, I'm skeptical that the structure of the world is in the way that it was, say, back in the 1930s and 40s. I'm skeptical of these arguments because there's so many different actors. I don't know what you call it right now, complex multipolarity moment. Some could argue we're already in it to some extent. I think that's an overstatement. But I do think that this war and the military actions, which, you know, I'm skeptical about because I lack a clear vision of what the political endgame is. It could serve as a vortex that inadvertently draws more and more actors in. Like if one of these missiles that was fired at our military base in Turkey hit its mark, you know, all sorts of nightmare scenarios that when Joel, I'm sure, was in CENTCOM, they game these all out. We need to watch very carefully, and we should have a steady hand at the wheel that's watching this, right? And that's what worries me, is that we may not have that right now in our political leadership. And I don't mean that just in terms of President Trump. Certainly, yes, him, but the sort of discourse that we have that we don't even talk about, we don't talk about Bruno. We're not really talking about this war in Washington in a considered, strategic, and thoughtful way among our political leaderships. It's just an opportunity to make hay, to score political points in this election, which, by the way, you know, I don't think was a brilliant political move for Trump to move into war with Iran in this sort of way. I don't know if it's going to work out, but me as somebody who's worried about the U.S. national security interests, what I worry about is that collective consensus. Maybe we never had it, but we have leaders on both sides that are actively seeking to drive wedges between us. And our adversaries see it every day, and I think we're going to pay in the long run for that.
So the regime you're describing, first of all, the regime she's describing, that's the law of the jungle. That is a rogue regime. And I'm, you know, I wish there had been a non-war way to handle that crazy, homicidal, slaughtering regime, which was killing not just his own people, but was lashing out at the rest of the region around it and international security. But nothing else was working. Nothing else worked. I'm sorry. And they got to the point where under the cover of international law, they grew into the monster that they became. They lashed out at everybody in a way that I think shouldn't be acceptable to anybody. I mean, and there's no need to extrapolate from the specific to the general on why would the United States take action against Iran, but not against Russia. Russia's a nuclear superpower. So, I mean, that's the world war that we wouldn't want to avoid. With this crazy regime in Tehran, you don't want them to grow into a nuclear superpower because they're ideologically driven, which is why if they had a nuclear weapon, they'd be more inclined than any other nuclear power to actually use it, including in stark contrast to Pakistan. But honestly, I think they've reached a dead end. They reached a dead end already. My personal prediction is that this is the end of them. And the Iranian people are going to have their chance at some point. It may not be in the next hour or but it will be in the not too distant future. It'll probably be sooner than we think that the Iranian people will have the chance to seize and chart their own destiny in a way that they've never had before. Not since 1906. First time since 1906, they'll actually be able to determine their own political future and social future. And I think there's just going to be an absolute explosion of creativity and joy come out of 90 million Iranian people. When that comes, it's going to change the world. It's going to change the rest of the 21st century. A flowering coming out of Iran. It could be messy on the way to that, but I honestly, the Iranian people are amazing. They have such talent, skills, and heritage that it's going to be an amazing thing to welcome them back to life on the world scene.
Well, that's an appropriately hopeful note on which to end. We do have to call a halt to our discussion. Thank you all. Please join me in thanking our panel.